Good evening all, and welcome. A house is somewhere you're supposed to feel comfortable and safe, but this isn't always the case if it's haunted. I also have the pleasure of being joined today by Sapphire from Stories with Sapphire. She is an absolutely brilliant channel, and if you would like to check out some of her content, you will find a link in the description and at the end of the video. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I was living in a house that was the model house before we bought it, so no one had lived in it prior to us. I was married to a man that I still feel today had a lot of dark energy around him. While in this marital home, one night I was doing laundry. The laundry room was right off the living room. The door was wide open, and the only light on was the laundry room light, which lit up the couches. I heard my husband say my name, so I looked up. There he was, sitting on the couch, but faced away from me. He had on a red baseball cap, which I thought was odd because I never see him wearing caps. I responded by saying, "Did you want to help me do the laundry?" There was silence, so I repeated myself, and I was met with silence again. Annoyed, I said, "Okay then, just ignore me, you weirdo." I suddenly felt this evil energy, so I grabbed the towels I folded and walked quickly to our bedroom towards the bathroom, and saw my husband in bed asleep. He was out completely. Besides, if that was him and he was playing a joke, there's no way he could have gotten past me, especially that fast. Weird things kept happening in our house. We had major electrical issues that would get fixed only to go bad again. Our air conditioning units both kept perishing. Then fixed, then perish again. Phones would never work. Our marriage was awful and my husband was very abusive. I felt this dark energy all the time. There was a door I would shut that would open the second I turned around. Nothing was wrong with it. Our master bath shower would come on full blast at 3 a.m. on random nights, and always the same time. One day, a frozen food delivery service was in our neighborhood. The man rings the doorbell and asks me if I want to buy anything from them. I politely decline and he says to me, "You know, if you ever need anyone to talk to about what's going on inside your home, you can always call my wife." Come again? I made no mention of this. I didn't know what to say and was shocked. "How do you know anything about my house?" I say. The chills came over me, every inch of my body. In front of my eyes, as if the sun rapidly set and the sky became dark. I was feeling this fight or flight, and I was starting to close the door a bit more. I looked at him, and the man's face changed into a distorted one. His ears looked pointy, and he looked so completely evil. I slammed the door, locked it, packed a bag, and as soon as he was gone, I grabbed my kids and went to my parents' house for the week. This disturbed me so greatly that I haven't talked about it in years. I don't know what your beliefs are, but this changed my entire outlook on life as I knew it. I'm not crazy, I know this happened. I've had many things happen to me since, including a visit from a loved one, and I 1,000,000% believe there are different levels of energy in this world.
My oldest son is 8 years old and has an amazing imagination, so for the longest time I disregarded his stories about his room. His room is on the second floor of our house, and there is a living room dividing his room from my youngest son's room. Ever since we moved here about 2 years ago, he has been complaining about seeing and hearing things in his room. He gives vivid descriptions of the sounds and creatures. Sounds include footsteps, sighs, things moving. The creatures include a dark, owl-like figure sitting outside the window with glowing eyes and claws, and disembodied glowing eyes in the corner of the room. Last night he was terrified and he came downstairs like 5 times, complaining about seeing small lizard-esque animals out of the corners of his eyes and hearing the sound of a walkie-talkie that nobody is speaking into, so like static. I told him to take our spare mattress and go sleep in his brother's room. Nothing ever happens when he sleeps in there, and he feels safer with someone in the room. After a while, it fell silent up there, so I thought he fell asleep. About half an hour later, I hear Legos being moved around and some bumps and movement, so I called up the stairs to him to go to sleep. It was late. I was tired and annoyed. I then start my night routine in the bathroom, then I settled into bed and closed my eyes. Not even 5 minutes later, I hear him calling me, so I decide to finally go up there and calm him down and turn on some lights. I get up there, and both boys are fast asleep, snoring, open mouths, and drooling. I have a moment of confusion, looking around the room and wondering what the hell. I decided that I was just hearing things and turned around to go downstairs. Standing in the doorway of my youngest son's room, I can see straight into the oldest son's room, and I see glowing eyes. I closed the bedroom door behind me, turned on the flashlight on my phone, and put my brave face on and walked to his door, only to find an empty room. So I went downstairs, went to bed, and thought about everything else he had seen and heard. I'm going back and forth about what happened last night, but what really gets me is something freaking calling me using my son's voice. I'm scared out of my mind, to be honest, and thinking about telling my husband when he wakes up. He works nights. But honestly, guys, what the hell is happening in my son's bedroom? My sons went to spend the weekend at their grandparents' house. My husband went to work the night shift, and I braced myself. That night, I went upstairs and took a look around before I went to bed. I made sure to mark my territory by walking into every room, making a round and saying out loud, "This is my house, and this is my son's room. You don't live here anymore." Now, some of you would clearly advise against this since I didn't know what was up there or if it was aggressive. But I didn't have sage to burn or time to call in a clairvoyant. I had 2 days till my boys would come home. That night, as I went to bed, I turned a little light on in my room. I was trying to not seem scared, but to hell with the darkness at this point. I laid down in bed, and the light blew up. It smelled horrible, and I was in complete darkness. I jumped out of bed and turned on the ceiling lamp, and it blew out too. So I did what any rational person would do. I freaked out and yelled. Things like, "So you're gonna blow up every lamp in my house? What then? I'm not going anywhere." I marched upstairs in the light of my phone's flashlight and chanted, "This is my house," a couple of times, until I calmed down and started to wonder if I messed up. My guess is that this thing knew what my intentions were and was pissed that my sons weren't in this house, so it took it out on me. I went downstairs, thinking I'm gonna be alone in this house until 7:30 in the morning. Shivering at this point, I went into the bedroom to change the light bulbs when I heard the piano in the living room. Just a frustrated smack on the keys. And then silence. The house was quiet for the rest of the night. Actually, for the rest of the weekend. We still have experiences, but a lot less than before. The kids stay in their rooms most nights, and they aren't scared anymore. I still prance around upstairs once a day, telling this thing to leave my house. It's a game of stubbornness at this point, I think. Well, thanks for reading this, and thanks for all of the advice that I didn't follow.
Let me preface this by saying that I have lived in my house for 2 years now, and haven't had a single paranormal experience. No strange noises, no catching things out of the corner of my eye, absolutely nothing. My house is 124 years old, and I haven't felt so much as a single hair stand up when I walk around. This morning I was in my bathroom brushing my teeth, with the bathroom door wide open, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head and saw there was a woman who appeared from the waist up only. She had turn-of-the-century clothing on, and she was wearing a bonnet with curly hair coming out of it. She wasn't exactly solid. She looked like she was shimmering, like how you see heat come off hot asphalt on a summer's day. I froze instantly. My mouth went completely dry, and I watched her float past my bathroom door into the guest bedroom. I don't know how long I held my position just staring into the hallway. I listened for some type of noise, but I didn't hear a thing. When the initial shock wore off, I went out into the hall and looked into my guest room, but there was nothing there. I know what I saw, and it caught me completely off guard, as I've never experienced anything like this before. I did believe in ghosts before all of this, but now I know without a doubt, it's a real phenomenon.
I feel like I should give some background about my family situation first, to avoid confusion. I have a half-brother, who I just refer to as my brother, who was 3 years younger than me from my dad's second marriage. I also have a full-blooded sister who was 2 years older. When my dad divorced his second wife, she got primary custody of my brother, so we only got to see him maybe every other weekend when he would come over. My sister and I spent most, if not all, weekends at our bio mom's house, which made it difficult to see my brother for any length of time except in passing. My dad went off with his soon-to-be third wife and left my sister and I with our grandparents who raised me from age 9 to 18. On the weekends, my dad and my brother would stay at my grandparents' house due to my dad wanting to keep his affair with his third wife a secret from my brother, for reasons that are too complicated to get into for this story. Hopefully that all makes sense. When my sister and I first moved in with my grandparents, they were getting ready to sell their house and move to a completely different town. Our new house was a bit bigger, and we each got our own bedrooms. We were very excited to be someplace new. I was 9 years old and in 4th grade. My sister was 11 and in 6th grade. My brother was 6 years old. I believed in ghosts prior to living in this house, due to an experience I had at a friend's house where I saw a shadow person. I was in no way a skeptic to the paranormal, but I didn't really connect the dots with the experiences I had until I was much older. The first odd thing that always stuck with me was the very first weekend my brother was over. I was going to my mom's house that weekend, and so my brother got to choose which of our bedrooms he would sleep in while he was with my grandparents. He picked mine, of course. I was very much a perfumey, smell-good, candle-loving type girl, and I didn't want a stinky boy in my bed, so I objected. He said he picked my room because my walls were painted blue, and that was his favorite color. He was very excited. My grandma didn't give in to my protests, saying that I needed to learn to share. When I came back from my mom's, my brother came to me and said that he didn't ever want to sleep in my room again because there was a ghost living in there. He was terrified and no longer excited. At the time, I thought he was just being a scaredy cat baby who still believes the boogeyman is under the bed. I scoffed and made fun of him as older siblings do. That moment always just stuck out to me for some reason. Now, looking back, I wonder what he experienced. They say young children are sensitive to ghosts. The next odd thing that happened was the first night we lost power. We lived in a wooded area, so in the fall, the wind would blow hard and knock branches into the power lines. We had constant power outages that time of year. That night when I went to bed, I had a dream that I woke up in the middle of the night. Everything in my dream was exactly as it was in reality. Same bedspread, same posters on the wall, etc. Only I had a fearful feeling come over me. I sat up in my bed and looked to the corner of my room where my bookshelf was. There, crouching in front of the bookshelf, was this grotesque, goblin-like creature staring at me. Something about it just freaked the crap out of me and made me wake up. When I woke up, somehow I was brave enough to look over at the bookshelf. there was nothing there. Every time the power went out, I slept in my sister's room. The dream scared me that much. Once again, I brushed this experience off as just a bad dream. The next thing that happened was perhaps the most bizarre. My grandparents spoiled me with a TV in my room with cable, so I would watch TV before bed every night. When I was ready to go to bed, I would turn the TV off and put the remote on my bedside table. It wasn't uncommon for me to toss and turn in the night and knock off the remote. I would often find it on the floor and under the bed, and even wake up to myself knocking it off. One morning, my remote wasn't on my side table. I looked on the floor and it wasn't there. I looked under the bed and it wasn't there either. I went as far as pulling all my furniture away from the walls to see if it flung across the room or something. I looked and the remote was nowhere to be found. I was at a loss. I had no idea where it could have possibly went. Weeks went by and I still couldn't find it. It just disappeared into oblivion. My grandmother was doing laundry and decided it was time to change the sheets on my bed. She couldn't lift the mattress up by herself to get the fitted sheet on, so I would help. I also couldn't lift it by myself, so we had to work together. When we lifted one side up, my remote was dead center between my mattress and my box spring. I was shocked and dumbfounded as to how the hell it got there. I never did rationalize it. It remains a mystery. A very similar thing happened with my glasses sometime later. I would also put them on my bedside table before bed. One morning, they weren't there. I searched and searched before I finally spotted them. They were on the top of my bookshelf. The top shelf was way too high for me to reach. I had to climb up the first two shelves in order to retrieve them. I didn't understand how they got there. Whenever my brother came over after his first time staying in my room, he would sleep in the living room with my dad. My dad didn't live with us, but would spend the weekends with my brother at my grandparents' house, as I've said before. My brother was terrified to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night by himself. The bathroom was directly across the hall from my bedroom. He would wake my dad to escort him. My brother finally confessed after all these years as to why. One time, he went to the bathroom in the middle of the night and he left the door cracked. While he was doing his business, a man's disembodied head appeared in the doorway, stared at him, and whispered something incoherent at him. That's why he never went to the bathroom alone again. Our bathtub had a sliding glass door as opposed to a curtain. I took a shower before bed one night, and when I stepped out, the glass door came off the track and slammed down on my foot. It severed my little toe like a guillotine. The door was never loose before that night and never did that before. I spent the rest of my evening in the ER. I don't know that this event was paranormal in nature, but when I look back at all the other things that happened, I do wonder. My sister, oddly enough, never experienced a single thing. But as my grandparents confessed when I was 18 and away at college, they too had experiences. When I was home visiting from college, my grandmother confessed that my grandfather and her were told when they bought the house that it was haunted. At the time, they didn't believe it, but weird things began to happen to them almost immediately. My grandma was cooking one afternoon while my sister and I were still at school, and my grandpa was taking a nap in their bedroom. My grandma put a spoon down on the counter after stirring the pot of food and turned around to wash something in the sink. When she turned back around, the spoon disappeared. She couldn't explain it until she found it later, in the living room, on the couch, on the other side of the house. Nobody else was home at the time. Several times, my grandma said she got locked out of the house. She would step onto the back porch and shut the sliding door behind her. When she tried to get in again, it would be locked. Sliding doors don't lock themselves. She would have to find whatever room my grandfather was in and knock on the window to get back inside. Apparently, this happened often to many of the doors we had that led outside, not just the sliding door. At night, my grandparents would be getting ready for bed, and when they turned off the lights one night, suddenly all the lights in the house turned on by themselves, and so did the TV in their room. The volume turned all the way up. They knew it was whatever was haunting the house, so my grandfather yelled, "Knock it off!" And everything turned off by itself in an instant. The realtor who sold the house to my grandparents disclosed everything to them. She explained the haunting as not being evil, but as mischievous. The most haunted rooms were the master bedroom where my grandparents were, my bedroom specifically, and the bathroom. When my grandparents told me their experiences, all the weird things my brother and I had experienced suddenly made sense. This mischievous spirit hid my things because it was funny to watch me struggle to find them. And the dream I had also made sense. I feel like it was the spirit communicating to me through my dream, making its presence known. Perhaps the shower incident was it trying to pull a prank, or maybe not, I don't know. I looked into the history of the house to see if there were any deaths, and there were none. The house was built in the 80s and had only one owner before us. We moved in 2003, so it was only 20 years old. The house was at one point struck by lightning, and the garage burnt down and had to be rebuilt, but no deaths. I hope you enjoyed listening to my experience, and I hope it makes sense. I'm not the best at articulating my thoughts.
About 4 years ago, my grandmother passed in her house. She passed of cancer, and it was a peaceful death. Then about 4 months after that, my step-grandfather also passed away. This one was a bit more brutal. He had gone into a big depression after my grandmother had gone, and stopped talking to the whole family except for one of my uncles, his son, and he was also the one who found him. My grandfather stopped taking all of his medications, which was terrible for him because he had hepatitis C, diabetes, and a few other disorders. He was found on the floor in the hallway and had been there for about 3 days. There was blood everywhere, and he was internally bleeding, and he began to cough and throw up blood. After both of my grandparents were gone, my family took over the house. We renovated everything. We had to put new carpet in. The old carpet was torn out because my grandfather had hepatitis C and his blood went everywhere. When we first moved in, my mum and I liked to sleep in the living room on the couches because our rooms were being renovated. Also, the cable wasn't set up yet, and neither was the internet, and we could watch DVDs in the living room TV. We lived very far out in the woods, near the Bohemian Grove, so we had to wait to get satellite internet. My mum and I would usually sleep out there at different times because my mum works graveyard shifts at a vet hospital. However, every time we slept out on the couches, something strange would happen. Almost every night, at 2:43, give or take a few minutes, I would wake up terrified, covered in sweat and breathing heavily, on the brink of tears. I knew I had woken up from a nightmare every time, but I never remembered them. This happened probably 20 times before I decided I was no longer going to fall asleep in the living room. So I slept in my bedroom. But the only thing that stopped was the waking up at the same time every night. The nightmares never stopped. I was constantly haunted by these nightmares. I've always had nightmares, but they never happened as often as they did when I moved into this house. One night while my mum was off work, she had asked me if I wanted to watch a movie with her in the living room. It was pretty late, and I knew I would fall asleep if I did watch the movie, so I said no. When she asked why, I explained to her, and she kind of looked shocked. She said she had been experiencing the same thing, but during the day, and sometimes at night when she was off work. It was the same time, during the day, and at night was 2:43 a.m. We were sort of relieved that we had both been experiencing this, but also sort of scared because we had no idea what was going on. One afternoon while my mum was sleeping out in the living room, she felt someone punch her in the side. She woke up thinking it was my dad or my brother messing with her, and she lifted her head up and said, "What's your problem?" And no one was there. She walked all throughout the house, and not a single person was there. It couldn't have been one of our dogs. She felt a distinct human hand hitting her in the ribs. So basically my mum decides to never sleep on the couch again. 3 years have passed since then, and we never did sleep on that couch during that period, and nothing really bothered us again, except for the nightmares that persisted. My boyfriend, who has been with me for over 5 years, even says that I've had more nightmares in this house than before we moved in. But about a month ago, my dad came home with a huge 4K TV. So of course, being the big movie buffs we are, my mum and I wanted to watch movies on there. Now, when I was watching movies out in the living room late at night, I usually stay up past 2:43 AM just in case, and nothing will happen. Except the other night. At exactly 2:43, I was awake and my mum had passed out. All of a sudden I start to hear a whimper. At first I thought it was one of my dogs wanting to go outside, but then I realized it was my mum, and when the whimper grew louder into a full scream, I woke her up and she was very confused and scared. I told her she was screaming, and she said that she just had a dream where she was laying down next to me on the couch, like she was just then, but I was asleep. She said she was unable to move and was trying to scream because she felt I was in danger, but she couldn't get the words out. Then a shadowy hand grabbed my face, and that's when she woke. My mum and I are the only ones who experience the nightmare and the specific times that the nightmares happen in the living room. Although when my older brother was crashing on our couch for a while, he claimed to have experienced some weird stuff too, like the feeling that someone was watching him sleep. We all have experienced things moving there on our own, like this antique kerosene lamp that we have on a shelf that just about touches the ceiling, flew off one day and shattered for no reason. It sucked getting the old kerosene smell out of the carpet. We've actually been losing forks as well. I don't know what that means, but they just go missing. And we're down to about 3 or 4 as opposed to the 10 we started off with. Our TV will turn off randomly at times without anyone touching the remote. And we used a warranty to get a new one, and the new TV does exactly the same thing. It's not a power issue where the TV just loses power or the plug isn't plugged in all the way. The TV screen says powering off and then shuts down. We do get random scents out of nowhere. My mum usually smells this old soap that smells like her grandmother, while I get a smell of something burning and it gives me a headache. My dad always smells something foul. These smells are unprompted. Usually only one person can smell it, and this has been slowly progressing over the course of the last 4 years. We're not really sure what's going on. I think it's my grandfather not happy that we're here. What do you guys think?
Before I begin my story, I want to provide some context by telling you about myself. I would like you to understand that I am a man of science and that I will not believe in something that I haven't seen or that hasn't been documented by a peer-reviewed authority, so astral projection is out. I am not religious, though I was as a child and young adult. I am a 22-year-old car salesman in Florence, Alabama. The rest of my family lives in Killen, and Killen is where a majority of these stories will take place. Please forgive any grammatical mistakes, as I am currently sitting in a 14 Passat TDI on the used lot with the doors open. I'm sweating balls and typing on a phone, so please bear with me. When I was born, my mother was a nurse on the night shift at ECM Hospital. My father was a pilot for Southwest and a former naval aviator. When I was 3, my brother Wayne was born. When I was 6, my father shot himself in the chest with a Colt 45, and my family moved in with my grandmother. My mother remarried, Benjamin, a social worker for a prestigious university in Birmingham. He is a medical professional like my mother, so they've always believed what they could see. We bought a house in Killen, built in 1920-something, and started our life together. There are few experiences that I remember from my childhood, but I'd say that's because my parents did an excellent job of hiding the truth from my brother and me, that our new house was haunted as hell. My first memory of anything strange had to be me walking to my parents' room in the middle of the night across the other side of the house and seeing a bright, glowing orb above the banister leading into the kitchen. I didn't know anything about orb phenomena until much later, although that is what I chalk it up to at the present. For me, the greatest threat I ever perceived was that of being watched near constantly. It was unshakable, but I just explained it to myself as God or Daddy watching me from above. Perhaps I was misbehaving. My parents, on the other hand, began to see a great many things. Most of the encounters were either audio or visual, but never both. They later told me of the conversations that would take place in the next room, which we were blamed for, at least at first, or of the shadows of a man in the next room, only to walk away if you approached. So far, it was some petty Scooby-Doo stuff. Then my father saw the ottoman move. He claims that this particular encounter happened maybe a year or two into our stay in that house. He had been laid off recently, and anyone who has been unemployed for a good amount of time knows that your sleep schedule tends to change. He was up at about 3 a.m., reading a book, when he heard what he described as perfect silence. He could hear his own heartbeat. This caused him to look up, only to see the ottoman, which rocks as it was designed for a rocking chair, to scoot across the floor very quickly, as if an equal amount of force had been applied to the top and bottom. He also says that when he looked up, all 4 of the cats had their ears pinned back, their heads locked on the ottoman. He is convinced that they could see whatever did this. After that, nothing happened to my parents. They attempted to make contact, to record an interaction with the entity. I believe that it avoided them on purpose. My brother, who was about 6, became the other family's new focus. He claims that throughout his childhood, he saw a woman with straight black hair, loveless eyes, and fingers like knives in the utility room every time he'd get a glass of water in the middle of the night. He claims this went on for years. Fast forward a few years, I'm 15 and he's 12, and my brother moves out of what was once our shared room into the former Braves/playroom. The walls are painted white with red and blue accents, with Atlanta Braves memorabilia hanging all over the walls. He, apparently, immediately began to see the woman in the room with him, as well as a tall man. She would tickle his feet and sit on the end of his bed. He also described waking up to find her dangling from the ceiling, her arms flailing like a rag doll in a Gmod video. He told me that the man would be hovering above his bed, inches away from his face, or sitting on a chair in the corner, his head in his hands, moving like he was crying. It is important to note that I am only being watched while all of this is happening. My brother probably attempted to open up to me about it, and I dismissed him because I was afraid of ghosts. He told my parents about the tickling, but left out everything else. My father spent a night in the room alone and came out reporting that nothing had happened, but he told the ghosts to leave my brother alone. For a time, I think they did. Then maybe a few months later, I saw my first apparition. I saw a figure in the corner of my room, and my chest wrenched in pure terror. I froze, my eyes locked on his figure until he blinked out of existence. Later that same week, I was laying on my side in bed, back towards the wall, my feet bundled under my blankets, when I felt her fingers run along my toes, slowly, forcefully. She then scratched my feet, as one would scratch the head of a purring kitty cat. I looked up and saw her. She was squatting on my footboard. Her hair so straight it could have been a hood. Her figure so black that I cannot properly describe the color. Think devoid of all light. When I looked at her, I literally felt fear and terror clutch at my chest. I couldn't move. I could only stare. She, too, blinked out of existence. So I told my mom, who then told me that the house was haunted, but not to tell my brother. Apparently, he had downplayed his experiences to the point where my parents thought the feet thing was just a dream. Now, Mom had 2 people who were claiming the exact same thing. It is important to note that my brother did not describe the woman to me until after I met her. These encounters became normal, and I eventually left for the military. I was medically separated in boot camp and returned home. I was angry, bitter, and had an incredibly short fuse. I had always wanted to fly planes for the Navy like my biological father had done. It was at this point that I had a coming to Jesus with the other family. I had taken on a job at Walmart stocking shelves and would get home at about 12:30 at night. I came home, sat down at my computer, and played video games for hours before trying to go to bed at about 5:30. She wouldn't let me. She scratched my feet. I sat up in bed and told her to go back to hell. She disappeared. I laid back down and drifted to sleep. At about 6:10, she knocked my Pip-Boy off of my desk. I stood up, collected the Pip-Boy, and set it back on the desk. I was angry. I was pent up from a long day at work. I was irritated at my fiancé, and I was hoping to get some sleep. The Pip-Boy was the last straw. I spun around and spoke with that heavy, shaky voice men get when they are so angry that they can barely form words. "This is my house, not yours. These are my things that my living hands can touch, not yours that your pathetic attempt at an existence can touch. Mess with me again, and I will end you." My voice had solidified halfway through the message to the point that I could speak clearly, but the rest of me was shaking with untuned rage. I remember 2 other moments in my life when I had gotten so angry. I was literally a hiccup's breath away from losing my grip. My garbage can fell over behind me. I turned around and screamed, top of my lungs, at the complete blackness that was standing right behind me. I still couldn't move, but I could scream. I screamed and screamed and screamed some more until I was out of breath. My mom came into my room to find me on my knees, muttering and sobbing. She said that I went on and on about how it wasn't my fault and that they wouldn't leave me alone. She said that she held me, a 6'1", 190-pound, 20-year-old man, and that I was crying and trying to scream so hard that I was shaking. My father says that everyone does that, or can do that, if they just go over the edge. He says that I had a psychotic break from all of the stress. He says the ghost wasn't there. That was 2 years ago. I sell cars now. I have a baby on the way and just moved into a duplex down the road from the same grandmother we stayed with so many years ago. Last night, my father saw a little girl. Apparently, she woke him up to ask where her mother was before running out of the room. He called me this morning and apologized for not believing me. I'm sorry for writing such a long story. I haven't told very many people, and I wanted to see if anyone else had any explanation for all of this. Thank you.
When I was little, about 7, whenever my dad was out of town for a business trip, I'd sleep in my parents' bed with my mum. This was one of those nights. Sometimes in the middle of the night, my mum would wake me up, saying that she heard someone in the house. It was only 2 of us and our dog. I listened, and I could hear a door slamming shut, opening and slamming shut again. The weird part was that it sounded like it was the same door over and over again. My mum called 911. while I silently cried in fear under the covers. I had never felt so much fear, and it was the first time in my life that I had been completely overwhelmed with panic. I also heard my dog going crazy out in the hallway. She was whimpering, and I could hear her collar jingle as she was running. I couldn't tell if she was running from something or chasing something. When the police arrived, the noises stopped. They searched the house, but found nothing. As soon as they left, me and my mum tried to go to sleep, but the door opening and closing started up again. My mum said she didn't want to call the police again, so I cried myself to sleep that night. When I woke up in the morning, it had stopped. There was nothing out of place, no open doors and no open windows. My mum doesn't like to talk about that night. For years after that day, I'd checked closets, under the beds, and anywhere someone might be hiding. Whenever I walked into a room, to this day I can't sleep somewhere if the door isn't locked. I'm 18, and now I can never forget that night. I've always been angry at my mum for waking me up to experience the whole thing when I could have slept through it and completely avoided the trauma. I also can't help but wonder what would have happened if I'd have slept in my own room that night.
To preface, I obviously can't be sure that it is, in fact, Edith Roosevelt's ghost I felt at the President's summer White House. However, my experience there leads me to believe that her energy is still in the house. I am an avid believer in the paranormal and have had many medium-like experiences, but I am still skeptical of every situation I encounter. I was on a school trip to Sagamore Hills, the house in which both Theodore Roosevelt and Edith Roosevelt died. The house had strange feelings right from the beginning, and in many parts of the house, I felt awful. I am very sensitive to changes in energy and have had experiences like this in the past. The outside of the house felt normal, and I wasn't expecting to have any paranormal experiences. About 5 minutes into the tour, I started to hear what sounded like my dog when she whimpers for attention. I figured it was just the 120-plus-year-old house making noises, but then I felt something brush up against my leg. Right after this, our tour guide began to talk about how the Roosevelt family kept many animals and pets in the home. I already knew this information, so I chalked the whimpering and feeling on my leg up to being my imagination. The guide kept talking, and then we started to look into the library. I didn't experience anything in that time, and the vibe of the room was normal. We turned around to face the room opposite of the library, and I immediately got a sinking feeling. Our guide began to explain that this was Edith Roosevelt's drawing room that she would often sit in by herself. Despite the room being well lit and painted bright blue, the energy instantly felt darker compared to the room across. As the tour guide shined the flashlight onto Edith's items, it began flickering at a very quick pace. He noted that this was strange, and keep in mind that this is a sturdy industrial flashlight used by a park ranger. Each time he brought up Edith, the light would start rapidly flickering. As he walked from the drawing room to the main living room, the light stayed normal. The whole time spent looking at the main study or living room, nothing out of place happened aside from a weird energy the room gave off. The guide then pointed his flashlight at 6 small statues in a bookcase that belonged to Edith. The light started flickering again when the guide was talking about how Edith would use these statues to impress guests who dined over. We left this room and then went to the dining room. Nothing strange happened here, and he didn't mention Edith. We shifted slightly away from the dining room to a small bronze statue of either a bull, buffalo, or bison, I don't remember which. He had the flashlight on this, and it was normally lit, until he brought up that Edith hated this statue. The light flickered like crazy again. We then walked into a narrow hallway that led to a bathroom, pantry, and kitchen. He spent most of this time talking about Theodore Roosevelt and the servants that cooked in the kitchen. He had his flashlight pointing to different things, such as a knife sharpener and a meat grinder. As he was pointing around the room, he said, "Edith planned the meals, but never cooked a day in her life." Once again, the flashlight started flickering intensely. Also following this, everyone began to notice a strong sulfur smell that wasn't there before. I've heard multiple times that a sulfur smell can mean a ghostly or even demonic presence. We then walked around upstairs for a bit, looking at the different children's bedrooms. This is unrelated to Edith, but my friends and I noticed that the oldest daughter Alice's room had a really awful energy compared to her younger brother's rooms. I'm not sure if it's worth noting that Alice was not Edith's biological daughter, and they had a strained relationship. We occasionally encountered cold spots, but this is a more than 120-year-old house, so it's bound to have some weird things. Once we got to the next set of rooms, those which belonged to Theodore and Edith, others started noticing a shift in the energy. Around their shared bedroom, nothing felt out of the ordinary except the flashlight flickering again. We walked over to the room that Theodore died in, and despite having the most direct sunlight in the house, it was the coldest room. This was the only strange thing surrounding Theodore himself. The next room over was the one that Edith died in. This room was stuffy and hot. It was around 55 degrees outside, so it's not like it was the weather. There was a significant temperature difference from Theodore's room and the rest of the house. The flashlight flickered yet again when the tour guide was talking about Edith and her death. The room had a really uncomfortable feeling, like we weren't supposed to be there. I started to get lightheaded and nauseous. I quickly noticed that in a corner between a window and a wall, there was something that looked like the air above hot concrete. After this, the tour was fairly normal. We walked away from Edith's room and past a linen closet and some other small rooms. In one of these rooms was a nightgown on a wire mannequin. I had this kind of mental image of Edith walking around the house in a long off-white dress, and when I saw the nightgown on the mannequin, I thought I had imagined it for a second because it was exactly what I pictured Edith as wearing. During this whole time, I kept having repeating thoughts of things like, she doesn't like the way they talk about her, and she was unfulfilled. These were not things the tour guide had said, or things that I could have known beforehand. These were just random things that kept popping into my mind. We ended the tour without further incident, and walking back outside was like a weight had been lifted. So, from this experience, I feel that there is a female presence in this house. I don't want to say angry, but that's the closest I can get to how this presence felt. Given everything that happened, I am led to believe that Edith Roosevelt is this presence, and she just wants to be left alone and respected. I didn't feel anything that led me to feel as if Theodore Roosevelt was still there, but the few haunted Sagamore Hills results I found only surrounded him. Tell me your thoughts about this. Could I be just reading into this too much? I have had many experiences where I feel unsure of the feeling I got, but this felt so strong. Has anyone else here visited Sagamore Hills and had a similar experience?
When I was younger, I lived in this pretty old house in a neighborhood. It was always creaking as old houses tend to do. I've always felt uncomfortable and weird when I'm inside the house, even during the day, and tried to play outside as often as I could. I know I wasn't the only one who felt this weird, creepy vibe, because my mother once asked me to be there with her one night while she was cleaning the kitchen as she felt uncomfortable. This house gave off a lot of bad energy. My parents did not get along, which resulted in a lot of arguments, which must have caused some trauma for me. I was so full of anxiety that I barely spoke to my parents and stuck to myself. Overall, a lot of bad vibes and energy. But in a more of a paranormal stance, There were also times when the TV would turn itself on or off. At some point when my dad was walking down the hallway, I saw a subtle glowing figure following behind him. I even remember falling down my bunk bed twice, and on the second fall, when I got up, I realized my head was somehow under the bed, as if I was being pulled under it. But the main thing that stuck out from living in this house was that I constantly had nightmares, specifically ones that were always held in parts of my house. I had nightmares where there was something in my closet that was trying to come out, and once I woke up and noticed that my closet was slightly slid open. I had another dream where there was something coming out from under the bed, the shed that we had in the backyard that my dad built too. I knew there were 3 of them living there, since there were 3 lines that moved through the tall grass, and they were moving towards me. I'd always wake up in the middle of the night and swore that a shadow had moved across my window at some point. 11 years later, my family finally moved to another home, and stepping into that new house never felt so calming. No creepy feeling that something was home, and no nervousness when alone in the house. I could never imagine going back. But some years later, my mum had a friend that by some odd chance moved into that same house. My mum asked her if it ever felt weird inside the house, and even her friend agreed that she never felt comfortable while she was alone in there.
Although I've experienced a couple unexplained phenomena, I'm still a bit of a skeptic when it comes to ghosts. It's something that I've got to see with my own eyes. What I've experienced before is hearing something, and the story I'm about to share now is when I felt something. Years ago, I went to visit a female friend in Seattle. During my stay, I had hooked up with her roommate, and for the remainder of my stay, slept with the roommate in her bedroom, which was downstairs in the townhouse that they shared. All except for one night. The time that I experienced something unexplainable was the night that the roommate worked the night shift at her job. When I had gone to bed that night, everything was normal as expected. To turn off the lights to the room, I had to do so from the light switch outside of the room next to the door. The room was really an office space. As I drifted off to sleep, I did so while laying on my back with my limbs stretched out. Everything was fine, and it didn't take long before I was in a deep sleep. At some time in the middle of the night, I was wide awake. I was still laying on my back, and I felt something physical happening to me. It was 2 things that I felt happening simultaneously. One of them was as I'm laying on my back with my limbs stretched out. It's hard to describe how the bed felt pressing against me, but imagine sand being poured halfway up onto your outstretched legs and how that sand fills the gap between the ground and your leg. I'm not trying to explain a feeling of grittiness, but how the bed seemed to fill that gap along the length of my body. I felt as though the bed was raised up along the edge of my body like I'm making an impression in it, and it is pulsing against me like a slow massage. The feeling of the bed pushing against me should be enough to freak me out, but it was the other sensation that startled me awake. My outstretched right forearm felt like it was being pressed down and squeezed. Imagine someone has their 2 hands wrapped around your forearm, holding it down, and they are alternating their squeezing from gentle to a bit more forcefully. That's what it felt like. In a panic, I sat up in bed and threw the blankets that covered me onto the floor, with my right hand pinning down whatever it was that was squeezing my forearm. Beneath my hand was the blanket, and whatever it was that was squeezing me was beneath that. Under my hand, I felt it squirm and wiggle, but the sensation of feeling it there dissipated until I felt nothing beneath my hand. This all happened in seconds. While sitting in the pitch blackness of the room, my mind was screaming, "What the heck was that?" I then started patting down the blanket that laid on the floor, trying to find whatever it was that woke me up. As I patted it down, my hand reached forward, and in the dark, I grabbed something that the blanket laid on. What was that? I realized that it was one of those white plastic patio chairs that was toppled over, and the overthrown blanket had covered one of the chair legs that I had grabbed onto. Stumbling in the darkness to the door, I quickly opened it and reached my hand outside to flip on the light switch. In my mind, I'm thinking that somehow a cat had gotten into this closed-off bedroom, and when I find it, I'll wring its neck. Not literally, but that's how upset I felt at the moment. Once the lights were on, I shut the door and started searching the room for something that I couldn't find. Finding nothing, I sorted out the bed and laid back down. Not sure what to do, I contemplated heading upstairs to ask my friend if I can sleep in bed with her. This made me feel silly, that a grown man would react like this, but I was freaked out. Laying there, I asked myself, what would my mother say in a situation like this? She once told me that if anything ever scares you at night, to turn your pillow over and say a prayer. Not really believing that, I did it anyway, as it was the only thing that I could think of. With the lights on, I drifted back to sleep with no other experiences for the remainder of the night. In the morning, I woke up as the roommate that I'm sleeping with returned from work and crawled into bed. After telling her of my experience, she laughed and said that it's probably the so-and-so spirits checking me out. She's Blackfoot Indian, and she had blessed her room with sweetgrass. The blanket that I threw on the floor, she's had for years, and it's been blessed too. They're there to protect her, she tells me, and probably wanted to scare me a little bit. I told her to tell them that they did a pretty good job and to leave me alone. She then tells me that my friend is up and not to tell her of my experience because it'll scare her. With the roommate getting some sleep, I came out to the living room of the townhouse. My friend was laying on the couch in the living room. I sat next to her and we chatted for a bit. Not being able to help myself, I asked her if anything strange ever occurred to her in the apartment. Her head tilted towards me, and her eyes were as big as saucers. Immediately, she asked me, what happened? After telling her my experience, she then shared hers. So, not too long after moving into her townhouse, she met her neighbor. After getting to know the neighbor, she was told that should anything ever happen to her at night, to bang on her bedroom wall, as the neighbor's apartment bedroom is on the other side. At the moment, she didn't think anything of it. One night, she was getting ready for bed. After popping a sleeping pill, she checked her apartment over to ensure that all doors and windows were locked and that she was alone. Satisfied that all was well, she went off to bed. As she was drifting off to sleep, she thought she heard someone running up the stairs of her townhouse and stopping outside of her bedroom. She was half asleep when she heard someone run from outside of her room back down the stairs. At that moment, she bolted upright in bed and strained her hearing to confirm what she thought she heard. What she heard next unhinged her. She heard someone outside of her bedroom, hopping up the stairs one at a time until the hopping sound stopped outside her door. At this point, she lost it. With her eyes clenched tight, she hugged the wall and banged away. After a few minutes, she got a phone call. Her neighbor was out in the hallway and was waiting for her to open the door. My friend was frozen there and couldn't move. She stayed in that position against the wall, eyes clenched and listening for what may happen next. Hearing nothing, she bolted out of her room, flew down the stairs to open her door. The neighbor was sitting out in the hallway and told her that it's about time. After sharing her experience, my friend tells me of other minor things that she has experienced there, like the feeling of being watched while she's in the laundry room at the top of the flight of stairs. As she mentioned that last part, I got goosebumps, as a few days earlier, I had the exact same sensation of being watched while loading my laundry, like someone was just outside of the room and watching me through the open door. For the remainder of my stay, nothing else extraordinary happened at my friend's townhouse. That was also the last time that I experienced anything supernatural. Hey everyone, my name is Sapphire Sindalo. You may know me as the creator of the Something Scary web series and podcast, or as a panelist on the Travel Channel's Paranormal Caught on Camera. I've always felt there was a lack of diverse, thoughtful, and genuine paranormal content, which is why I created Stories with Sapphire. It's my latest podcast where I share my personal exploration of paranormal and supernatural phenomena through stories, interviews, poems, and art. The entire first season is available and ready for you to binge on my channel, youtube.com/Sapphire Sandalo, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Season 2 is premiering on May 20th. You can also submit your stories on my website at storieswithsapphire.com. That's Sapphire, Sapphire. Salamat and good night.